Now, the origin of counterterrorism measures, just to briefly overview, obviously it goes back more than 20 years and longer, but the proliferation of more counterterrorism really began, not surprisingly, after 2001. And there was a series of UN security resolutions, predominantly that of Resolution 1373, which began to infiltrate and began to influence domestic measures to combat terrorism. Now, for humanitarian organizations, and a little bit akin to what Tristan was saying earlier, of course, as a humanitarian organization, we recognize the importance of combating terrorism. That's not the question. Our question is just how do we preserve principled humanitarian action? Now, so it's all very well to talk about humanitarian principles, but where does this link with IHL, and where does this link with our ability to operate? A large part of humanitarian organizations are principally financed, as I'm sure you know, by states. NRC is one, and very many others are funded by a diversity of states. So, for example, any one NGO like ours can be funded by a mixture of the United States, by the European Union, by Norway, by Canada, any number of states. And all of this is what feeds into our financial resources, which enables us to deliver assistance. Now, where one of the intersections lie is whereby counterterrorism clauses are have long since started to appear in the contracts which we sign as a humanitarian organization with our donor. We maintain a diversity of donors to support our operations in order to hopefully being able to balance and secure our longevity. But more and more we see these clauses coming up in contracts. And just to give you an idea of some of the clauses that we see, but this is a very live topic, and it's very much evolving. So every time I discuss a clause, there's another that came out. There's another one which is coming out tomorrow. So it's constantly evolving and not necessarily improving, unfortunately. But for example, we see clauses such as organizations being prohibited not only from providing support to designated terrorist groups, but also those associated with designated terrorist groups. Now, for a humanitarian organization, or for anyone for that matter, how do you define being associated with a terrorist group? And I don't have an answer. We have explored this topic at length, and there is no clear answer necessarily. Being associated, does that also include a mother, a child, a neighbor, a cousin, somebody who's in a camp with some identified individuals but happen to be in the tent that's in the same block? How do we define that? And those sorts of clauses leave a lot of risk for an organization or for staff who are delivering aid. Another such clause that we see is that humanitarian organizations are asked to employ all reasonable efforts to ensure that assistance is not diverted to a designated terrorist group. How do you ensure that when you're delivering assistance to tens of thousands of people, how do you ensure that one of them might not be a designated terrorist? It raises a lot of questions, a lot of concerns, but I'll come to that a little bit later. So, because of this, NRC has conducted a range of studies into this topic, like I mentioned, to really see what is the evidence, if there is evidence behind an actual impact on the ability to deliver assistance. Over the last number of years, we've conducted studies and consultations and workshops and trainings in places such as Somalia, organizations working on Syria operations, Yemen, Afghanistan, and discussed at length both with NGOs, national organizations, UN agencies, donors, and even local domestic auditors as well, because they have a lot of insight into this topic. And there are a few things which we see coming up over and over again from no matter where we have these discussions. So an idea of some of the impact that we have identified. And this has been complemented by studies conducted by other organizations as well, and other universities too. So one of the most predominant impact is delays in delivering assistance. So the time that it will take for a team in Somalia or in Iraq or elsewhere, the time that it will take for them to negotiate some of these clauses, which transfer a lot of risk to their organization. The time that it takes to negotiate some of these clauses with donors to try and protect themselves. If there are clauses that require an organization to screen or to vet staff or partners or anyone else, or hopefully not beneficiaries, the time that it takes to do all this leads to delays. Every day that you spend going through the negotiations for this is more days that you are not delivering assistance to communities who are, like I said before, who are most in need of assistance and protection. There are also concerns around, persistent concerns around staff and partners' right to privacy. So this comes back to the screening and vetting question. Depending on your donor and depending on the requirement and depending on where you are, at the level of degree to which you are asked to screen or vet your staff or your partners can bring into question the right to privacy, and also ultimately whether you choose to accept them or accept the funding, or maybe you choose not to. There is persisting concern about prosecution of humanitarian actors because of these clauses which are appearing in contracts. Even though there are extremely few examples of humanitarian organizations actually being prosecuted over this, it does not remove the concern that organizations have, which ultimately impacts their decision of where and when to operate. Another major concern is for local staff, and I've seen this with colleagues over the last numbers of years, of colleagues not being quite sure of what level of risk they're taking on. So are they going to be protected by their organization? Now, for NRC, I can just add the caveat that we have taken measures to provide protective policies for local staff, but regardless, across the sector, what degree are they protected by the organization if they are found to, without even realizing it, if they are found to have fallen foul of a counterterrorism law because when they negotiated with a local leader to access a community and later it turned out that local leader was actually a designated terrorist by one of the donor states, how are they protected? And these are the people who we're putting on the front line. These are people we're asking to put their own lives and potentially the security of their families on the line in order to deliver aid. So this is a major, major concern. And ultimately what this all leads to as well is risk aversion, because there are so many unanswered questions. Because not only are there a lot of unanswered questions, but a lot of organizations this is a very complex issue. A lot of organizations aren't even entirely sure what they should be asking. So for fear of not knowing what risk they're taking on, sometimes organizations will just choose, we're just not going to go there. And there are some classic examples in the Middle East where organizations have sometimes said, look, we're not too sure what risk we're taking on ourselves if we go to this location, therefore let's just play it safe and not go there. And the ultimate, the last line of impact of all of this is that there's less needs-based assistance. And that's the cornerstone of our work. That's the cornerstone of the humanitarian principles. So when you are risk-averse because of all of these aforementioned issues, you're providing less assistance. And the irony of all of this is that those who suffer the most are the very communities who might be suffering at the hands of designated terrorist groups anyway, and now are falling short in terms of receiving assistance because of measures aimed at combating those same groups who are putting them on the front line anyway. So it's a very, very complex topic. So for us, it's been very important to try and unpack these topics, unpack these issues, and find ways of preserving humanitarian action and humanitarian space, which we've done at length. And what's a really important point in all of this is that some of these contracts clauses that we see and the language that we see is a lot about just saying you are taking on all the risk, you are taking on the responsibility. It is no longer once we sign this contract, then we to some degree are assuming that if aid is it does end up in the hands of a terrorist group, that you will be liable for it. And the reality is that, as far as I can see, there is no such thing as zero risk. You cannot say that you will guarantee, and you must guarantee, that no aid will end up in the hands of a designated terrorist, an entity. This is not a realistic expectation. We can put in the most robust systems possible, but you will never remove that element of risk. And so what we have tried and continue to try, along with a lot of other peer organizations, is to really look into risk sharing and what it means to share risk across stakeholders, between the donor, between the maybe a UN agency, an international NGO, a local organization, whoever is in that chain, however many layers there are on that chain, that the risk is shared and that there is a discussion around what level of risk is acceptable and what is not. If the level of risk, after you do an assessment of the risk that remains, if it's deemed not to be acceptable, then fine, we make a decision, and perhaps that decision is not to conduct a particular operation. That also leads to another issue which has come up quite a lot, which is around what we call trickle-down clauses, whereby we see more and more, particularly in remote management operations, whereby one organization will subcontract to another organization, who will subcontract to another organization, and these clauses just trickle down the whole way until it gets to the last line. Just to comment actually on one of the other questions which you posed related to the resolution 2178 on foreign terrorist fighters, just an additional comment on that that resolution now is exactly 2 years old. It was released in September 2015, and NRC actually supported the Harvard Program for International Law and Armed Conflict to do a study 1 year afterwards. Sorry, 2014, 1 year afterwards, to look at if there was any impact of the implementation of that resolution by member states on humanitarian action. Now, it was a kind of an early study because it was done 1 year afterwards, so it was still evolving. And though that resolution does have a provision for IHL and human rights law, what we actually do find and do see more and more, but it's still quite early, is an impact, particularly in terms of travel restrictions for people around the world, for people who are providing humanitarian support in areas of armed conflicts, that it is increasingly difficult to travel to those areas as a result of the evolution of that resolution. And also more administrative procedures and restricted access to finances, although the restricted access to financial services is something we see as a result of a lot of counterterrorism measures.